Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We look today at the fourth and final section in Imam ad-Dabusi's presentation of the sources that lead to definite and certain knowledge about God's law. The first of these was the Book of Allah. The second was a hadith heard directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The third was a hadith that reaches us through mass transmission. And the fourth and the final of these four is the consensus of scholars. And this topic of the consensus of scholars is by far the longest in his treatment of these four sources of definite proofs of God's law. Reason being is that this one is not proven rationally, unlike the others. And so when talking about the Quran being a proof of sacred law, he relied on proofs established in, appears in the science of Kalam. He didn't see the need to repeat them. When talking about mass transmission, again, it was quite a simple rational topic. But this topic here is not proven directly through rational inference. Rather, it's proved through an understanding of those previous sources, i.e. texts conveyed through the Holy Quran. And so this topic is long, and he covers it in three relatively longer sections. The first one is one that we're looking at right now, which is the first of these. He says, clarifying that ijma of this ummah is a proof. That's what we're looking at right now. Ijma meaning the consensus and agreement of scholars. His second section, of about equal length, he'll define what is ijma. He doesn't actually define it in our current section. What exactly is it, and various debates about the definition of scholarly consensus. And then in his final presentation on this theme, he'll talk about the various types of consensus that have been accepted and various debates concerning that. So he starts this current thing. The goal is just to say ijma is a proof of sacred law, by stating simply that fact, the consensus of this nation is a proof that necessitates knowledge. It leads to certain knowledge. But it does so shar'an, not aqlan, meaning your rational mind cannot conclude this fact. Because it's quite possible that this fact not be true. It's quite possible the opposite be true, that people could agree and it's all wrong. And so the fact of it being a proof is from sacred law, from sacred sources, from God making it so, not from any other inference. And that's why the presentation is longer, because you have to show how Shara'an, using the Holy Book and the hadiths of the Messenger, you arrive at this understanding. And he gives the basic reason for this. If it's not rational, then why is it there? Because God Most High is honoring this religion, i.e., this particular following of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah ennobles this group of believers, and by making their consensus a mark of God's will on earth. And what's the proof that this is purely shara'an and not aqlan is because the Magians have agreed on many things that we know to be false, from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, teachings of His Messenger. And you could add also rational inference as well. And similarly, Jews and Christians and all groups of unbelievers. And they are more than us in number if you add all of them up. So it's not at all a rational inference at all, but it's shara'an. And that's why the whole chapter is about sacred sources and their interpretation. And he says again, why it can't rationally be so, that ijma is a proof. He says because consensus is something that people can do just blindly following their fathers without any proof. To marry him of that way or that imprint on them, like the unbelievers have done. And so it itself cannot be a proof. And therefore we know that our consensus was made a proof purely through the sacred sources, i.e. in God's making it so, God's willing it so, God's revealing it so. And so the section then, after that introduction, is just about interpreting sacred sources. And he'll do this by focusing on 5 Quranic verses and 2 hadiths. And throughout, some of these verses he'll do quickly, and 1 or 2 he'll spend really quite a bit of time on. with quite a bit of back and forths. He doesn't always quote the verses in full, so where necessary, I've just added the relevant additional words. So his first verse, and I think he's quite short on this one, yeah, it's just this slide, is this verse here from Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah is the protector, the helper, the supporter of those who believe. He takes them out from darknesses into light. And so he's informed us that he takes the believers from the darknesses of unbelief and falsehood to the light of faith and truth. And so, were it to be possible that when they agree to something it is false, then they as a group are in darkness. But this is not what God has told us, Most High, and therefore this cannot happen. That's it. Very, very simple inference. The fact that Allah has said He takes this group of believers into light, then if all of them agree to a particular point, that this point is true, then it has to be true. Otherwise, Allah has not taken them out of darkness into light. Simple as that. Just quotes a related verse with this idea. He is the one who sends blessings upon you and His angels to take you out from darknesses to light. That's his first verse. Very short inference. Second verse, slightly longer one. We've got 3 slides here, and I've copied across all of his words. This is the complete text of his discussion here. The verse, first of all, and just a rough translation. You are the best of nations brought out for people. You command what is good and you forbid what is evil, and you believe in Allah. So he said, Most High, you are the best of nations brought out for people. And the word khair, often translated as good, but actually means best. Its meaning is this comparative. And when it comes in this construction, better of the nations means best of. So it's a comparative, or in this case, superlative. And it indicates the absolute limit of goodness, because it means best, the most good. And the essence of this most goodness, what does it mean that you're the most good? It means that the slave is with the truth. This is what goodness means. And then the limit of goodness, i.e. bestness, is that you are with the truth in reality, that what you are upon, what you hold to be true, in actual fact is truth. That's what it means to be best. And so describing them with bestness, with the meaning of, again, this superlative, is that they strike, without any doubt, they strike the truth if they were to agree upon something. The truth that really is true with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they were to agree upon a thing. Otherwise, they are not best. And that truth cannot evade them altogether if they disagree. Meaning, if this nation on a particular question has 5 positions on a particular point of sacred law, one of those 5 has to be the truth with Allah. It can't be that they've missed it altogether. And he's looking at that from the angle of their bestness. Bestness meaning that they're on the truth. Then he says, looking at the latter part of this verse, you command what's good and you forbid what's evil. And what's good and evil, when mentioned absolutely, is of course what's good and evil with Allah, i.e. the reality of the case. Then he says, possible question, but hang on, an individual scholar might hold something to be right and wrong, and he's rewarded for that. So he says, as for the position of an individual scholar after exerting his effort, he might not strike what is really right and wrong, because he's tried his best. He might have got it right, he might not have got it right. So there's a premise in Imam Debussy, which was the most popular understanding amongst Hanafi authors, which is that there's an age-old debate in Usul al-Fiqh, which is when scholars exert their effort to find, what is the right ruling about a particular question. Is there such a thing as an ultimate truth with God that they're trying to find? Or are all of them equally true? And so what certainly the Hanafi theorists felt by far was that there's an ultimate truth with Allah and we have to try and find it. And that's what the premise is in this entire passage. So he says an individual mujtahid or scholar might exert his effort and he'll hold a belief, such and such is right, such and such is wrong, but he might not get it right, what's really right with Allah. He might not have got it the correct answer. And so this is good and evil with respect to him and his effort, but it might not be good and evil in the most absolute sense. But we're not talking about the individual people, we're talking about the nation, the entire group. And so what we're talking about here is clarifying what's meant by the beginning of the verse. I.e., the beginning of the verse said, you are the best of nations, because when you call to the truth, you have found the truth, i.e., the truth with God. And so he's saying this latter part informs the first part of the verse, namely that they are the best of nation because of this, which is namely that they strike the truth in absolute terms. An individual might not get it right, and he's a great scholar, but if the group, the nation agrees that such a point or position is the correct one, then that's what the verse is saying. You command to the truth, and that's why you are the best. Separating the collectivity of scholars versus an individual who might only have a relative understanding of right and wrong, but not the absolute. If it's said, the meaning of you command is not as one group, but as a group of individuals, i.e., each one of you is commanding. Just like quoting, if you say the people put on their clothes, it means every individual puts on the individual's clothes. There's no collective group wearing a collective clothing. So similarly, this verse is not talking about one collective position, but lots and lots of individual positions. But you've just said an individual's position is not a proof. Only the collective's position is a proof. So this verse isn't a proof for you then. He says, yes, but if each one of them is commanding to the good, then the absolute good, which I, the ultimate good with Allah, must be among what they are commanding. Like I said previously, it can't evade them. The truth must be among them. Otherwise, this group as a group is not calling to the good, the absolute good. But they are the best, because as a group, they call to the absolute good. And if they were to agree, that agreement must be the absolute good. So that's the angle he took on that verse. Then he comes to the third verse, and this is the verse he spends the most time talking about. He doesn't quote it all in full, but the verse, this is not the full verse either, but it's what's relevant to us, which is, and again, in rough translation, we're made you the most balanced, and he's going to say it means the most best nation, so that you can be witnesses over people, and the messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, can be a witness over you. So first of all, he says wasat, normally means middle. He says wasat in linguistically actually means the one whose words are accepted, whose words are correct, whose words are authoritative, you could say, acceptable, good, pleasing. And he quotes another Qur'anic verse. It's a story in Surah Al-Qalam about a group of people that tried to go early in the morning to harvest the fruits of a garden, so that they wouldn't have to share it with the poor. But lo and behold, the garden, all of its fruits were destroyed, and they realized that they were mistaken in trying to deny the poor their right. And so one of them, of this group, described as their awsat, their most middle, he's the one that told them, you guys should really make tawbah and come back to Allah and not follow such a path. And so he was the best of them. And so that's what awsat means, the best, the most correct. So this is the verse he's using to prove what wasat means. قَالَ أَوْسَطُهُمْ, the best of them said, didn't I say to you? And then the stories in this surah, who wants to follow it up, verse 28, i.e., the one whose words were most correct, most accepted. Now, absolute acceptability of someone's words means they've arrived at what really is true with Allah, because a mistake in its essence is something to be rejected, to be forbidden, not to be accepted. Now, someone who is mistaken might be excused because he's unable to do better than that. He might even be rewarded, commensurate to the effort he exerted in trying to find the truth. But error, in and of itself, cannot ever be called pleasing to Allah. So he's again going to this paradigm that an individual might do their best and might get it wrong. And we might still hold that they're rewarded for that because of their effort. But that doesn't make that position to be truth. Again, the premise that there's one real truth that scholars have to arrive at. So when we say this nation is the nation whose words are pleasing and positions are accepted, we must mean that the positions are correct. Because when a scholar is wrong, he's rewarded for the effort, but we don't say the position is pleasing as such. It's still wrong. And so when Allah says this nation is a nation whose positions are pleasing, it means that they have to be correct as well. They arrive at the actual truth with Allah, which is what we're interested in here. Then he speaks about the second part of this verse after discussing the meaning of wasat. So you can be witnesses over people. So he says this phrase, you can be witnesses over people. What's a witness? It's someone who speaks with knowledge about a fact so that his words can be taken as a proof. That's what a witness is in a court. So there's a court imagery here. And so Allah is saying, you, the Muslims, this nation of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, your words are pleasing, your words are correct, so you can be a proof over people. So this verse indicates that they have knowledge about the rulings of Allah that pertain to people, and that their words are a proof over people with respect to the right of God, what is due to God. And Allah knows the reality of matters. And so nothing can be a proof returning to uh, his due or his duty, or you could say a proof with respect to him, a proof that he accepts regarding his judgments and rulings and commandments, except something which gives definite and certain knowledge. It has to be correct, because Allah knows the realities of things, and He's established this nation as a proof to His due, to His right, a proof that He's accepted. And if He's accepted it, then it has to be right, because He knows the realities of things. And therefore, this nation, when it agrees and testifies that some such and such is God's ruling on something, it has to be correct. It has to give definite knowledge. So he wants to hint at this point now, which is that it definitely leads to knowledge. There's no doubt about the content of what it conveys. As opposed to when people are testifying to the rights of people, not the rights of Allah. Because when it comes to our own rights in this world, we don't know what they really are in reality. You know, is this house mine? Is this house not mine? We don't know the realities of things. We can only testify to what we think is the case at hand. We only testify to what appears to be the case. So our proofs amongst ourselves in our disputes are commensurate to our rights, and our rights are not absolutely known for sure. But the rights of Allah are absolute realities. They are absolute truths. And therefore, when this nation can testify to the absolute truth, then it is doing so in an absolute way. It gives definite knowledge. When we testify to God's hukam, it gives definite knowledge. When we testify to our rights, it's probabilistic knowledge. So similarly, Allah's informing us about their knowledge, obviously, is about the reality of the case. I.e., their knowledge is real, it's true, when they testify to His ruling. Haven't you seen that Allah has compared our testimony over people to the testimony of the messenger over us by saying, and the messenger, the third part of the verse, will similarly be, there's a comparison. You will be witnesses over people, just as, similarly, the messenger is a witness over you. And we know when the messenger testifies to the ruling of Allah, it gives to a definite knowledge, a certain knowledge. Doubtlessly, that is the case. So similarly, doubtlessly, we are the case over humanity in testifying to the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just to complete that thought, he says, because the testimony of our group, if it doesn't lead to certain knowledge, just like the revelation does, then another group can oppose us. And then we're not a proof anymore at all. Because if you say that if the Muslim community unites, he'll discuss in the later section which members of the community he's interested in. But let's just say for now, the community as a whole, if they were to unite and say such and such is right or such and such is wrong, if this is not definite but only probabilistic, it could be right and it could be wrong, then any other community can come along and testify also, and a third community and a fourth. And then there is no more proof anymore in consensus. But these verses are testifying the consensus is a proof, which must necessitate definite knowledge, certain knowledge. It's not probabilistic. There's no room for debate. There's no room in it. It's clear. It's like a verse of the Holy Quran. And that's an incredible status. And that's what he meant at the beginning. It's an ennoblement for this nation that Allah has made them equivalent to a revelation that's come from heaven. If they agree, it's as definite as a statement in the Holy Book. That's the karama he was referring to, and it has to be the case for this set of verses to be understood that he's presenting. Can you see he's got still quite a bit more to say about this verse. Next one, objection. You might say, but this verse is about the next life. It's not, in the next life, this community will testify as a proof in the court of God in the next life, but it's not about this life. He says, yes, but we say, first of all, look carefully. The verse doesn't say that. You're saying that. So this is not a proof. You're suggesting otherwise. The verse doesn't say that clearly. And because the testimony of the next life is a testimony where we will testify in a court of judgment to what we knew in this life. Just like in a regular court. In a regular court, you testify about something you observed outside of the court. Otherwise, you can't testify in court from something you heard about in the court. Similarly, if it is true that we're talking about testimony in the next life, it's only because of things we knew in this life. Otherwise, we wouldn't be witnesses. So he says, if our testimony wasn't a proof that leads to definite knowledge, then we wouldn't be asked to come and we wouldn't be summoned to deliver our knowledge in that court over there. And he says, the judge in question knows the unseen. He does not judge except by an evidence which is true in reality. It really leads to truth. Well, he wants to just emphasize that this consensus leads to the real truth with Allah. There's no relativism and there's no probability in it. That's what he wants to really emphasize throughout his arguments here. So this is another one. Allah knows the unseen. When he made this statement a proof in his court, it meant that this statement leads to truth in reality, the consensus of this community. And if you were to suppose that our knowledge right now could be mistaken, if we were to agree upon something, then our testimony could not lead to a definite knowledge which doesn't have room for error in it. Again, just saying the same thing. How can we be a proof in that court unless we hit the truth now? That's what he's trying to say. It's the same thing, just said in a bit differently. And because when Allah specifies the next life, he specifies the messenger with testimony. So he's now refuting that this is not necessarily about the akhirah, because there's no tafsil in the ayah, there's no distinction. He says when Allah speaks about the next life, he specifies the messenger, and he uses some other verses that speak about the next life. We've brought you as a witness over them, and the day when we bring forth from every community a witness over them from themselves, and we bring forth, the verse continues, we bring forth you as a witness, O messenger. And so in those verses, he doesn't mention a witness from your nation. He just mentions you, the messenger, are a witness on Judgment Day. And so these other two verses indicate that what's meant in the original verse is a testimony in this life, not a testimony in the next life. Another objection. If you say what's meant in this verse to be witnesses over people is simply that you will convey to them the Quran and the hadith, You are a witness over the revelation that was revealed, not over new positions that you might take. We'll say, the verse doesn't say that again. You're restricting the verse by yourselves. And because the verse doesn't specify what it is that they're testifying to. This is a printing error. I checked in another edition. It's not ta'ayyun, it's ta'yin. So specifying what it is that they're testifying to, restricting it only to Quran and Hadith, and saying that this verse only connects to that, Quran and Hadith, is modifying the Book of Allah. And we treat such modifications as abrogation, as we'll show you later. This is not merely interpretation. He's referring to a principle that will come later, probably in some detail, which is that for Hanafi scholars, the Quranic verse is understood in its most general, most wide, most clear interpretation, and you cannot restrict the Quranic verse through an evidence which is more probabilistic or which is probabilistic in nature. And they treat this as abrogation. So he's saying you're restricting the verse only to transmitting Quran and Hadith is a sort of abrogation, is a sort of negation of what the Quran is conveying. And you don't have the right with your own mere opinion to abrogate the holy book. So be quiet. This is not acceptable. This is not, you're not interpreting, you're abrogating. You have no right. That's his first response to that. Then he says, another angle why this can't simply be about transmitting the Quran and Hadith, because mass transmission, the topic of the last lesson, only occurs from a people that it's inconceivable ordinarily that they can agree upon an error, meaning it's a very large group we're talking about because there's so many of them. But consensus of the scholars of this nation is a proof, even if the scholars of this nation are only 3 or 5 or 10, a number that conceivably can make an error. So he's saying being a witness in a court because of knowledge is not about numbers, because he'll say later we're talking about the scholars who might be few, because only the learned can be witnesses. So this is not tied to mass transmission. It's not tied to transmitting sacred texts. So two responses to that objection. Another objection: if you were to say God's making them sort of balanced nation, the nation whose words are accepted, so that they can be a proof, does not indicate that they can't ever agree upon falsehood. Because God says elsewhere, Allah says elsewhere, Most High, I only made jinn and humans to worship me. So he's told us he made them to worship him, but that didn't mean that they couldn't all stop worshipping him. And many of them don't worship him. And it's conceivable they all stop worshipping him, according to this objector. We say, so this debate is about this lamb of Li, because we're saying Allah made them a balanced nation, or a nation whose words are accepted, so that, and the objector is saying, yeah, but the so that's don't always come true. You have no proof that so that is definitely going to be the case. They might not be witnesses always. And he says, yes, but the meaning of the so that is that Allah has made it such. Allah has determined it such. Allah has honored this group such by making them a group whose words are pleasing and accepted. Allah has chosen them so that they could be this wasat group. They have become witnesses who can testify through a definite knowledge, because they arrive at the actual truth because of this trait that Allah has given them. Just like, it's just, he's what I was trying to say, it's a trait Allah's placed in them. It's a description of who they are and what they are. Just like Allah created them free, so they could own what is other than them. So this lamb, the lamb of the so that in this verse, is to clarify this trait of theirs, the trait of middleness or correctness that Allah has given to them as a gift. And so the reality of this trait in them necessitates this fact or this judgment about them that they will be correct witnesses. because the cause is in them. Just like they have the capacity to own if freedom or freeness is in them. And that's what linguistically has to be understood here by the li of the lam. Similarly, just like Allah has created prophets, may Allah be pleased with them, free, protected from falsehoods, protected from lying, protected from sinning. Likewise, He created the angels. And that's why these groups, when they speak, i.e., angels and prophets, because Allah's protected them from uttering falsehood, when they speak, it leads to definite knowledge. It's the way He's made them. It's a trait of theirs, if you like. But this reality of the li was not followed, was left, was not maintained, was not intended in this other verse. He created men and jinn so that they worship Him, because if this was to be interpreted if this was to be intended in its literal, real meaning, then it would mean that worship occurs by compulsion. And that is not the objective of why men and jinn were created. They weren't created to worship out of compulsion. They were created to worship out of choice. Because what's intended from us is a worship with choice in matters. That's what we're created for, to choose. And that's why this particular verse is different in how this lam of in order to is being used. And so through this indication, we know that what's meant by it is we created men and jinn to charge them with worship, not that worship was their trait. And in truth, this is correct. There's none of us except the trust of Allah, which the human being has borne, is on that person. So the verse is literally correct. Each of us has the burden of worship on us. And he says this particular verse he's referring to, the verse of the trust, will come later. Just want to reflect. No, it's fun. I mean, his focus wasn't so much on the lamb, although he did refer to the lamb here. The focus was just on this nation of the ja'al. In what sense did he make you? So he's saying, no, the meaning of make. So the contrast is not just on the lamb, but simply just on also this, there's the creating and there's the making. So he says, no, the basis of this making and this creating is it's an intrinsic trait. It's the way that people are. But the intrinsic trait couldn't have been the compulsion to worship. It was the duty to worship that was this intrinsic trait. It wasn't just a comparison of lambs, just to point that out. So this is so similar to saying that you may be witnesses over people is the messenger being a witness over you. So he's a witness over you because he's made, if you like, his nature is he speaks truth. And so we as a community, our nature is that we speak truth. Another objection. If it's said that the khabar al-wahid, which is a report which is not mass transmitted, there's a room for error in its transmission. If you were to say that the khabar al-wahid is a proof concerning the right of Allah, the law of Allah, and so is consensus, so is analogy or qiyas, but these don't lead to certain knowledge. So he's going to say there's things which are proofs of sacred law that don't lead to certain knowledge, but they're probabilistic. They might be right and they might be wrong. So why can't the statements of this community be like that? We'll say, but we respond, he says, the basis of all the proofs is the khabar al-Rasul, like he said last time. The essence of all the proofs is the words of the messenger. And his words lead to definite knowledge, like we've seen previously. The doubt in khabar al-wahid, this not mass transmitted report, the doubt which made it probabilistic, may be right and may be wrong in what it conveyed, was not because it's the word of the Prophet, it's because of the way that it was transmitted. And the transmission brought an error into it. And the way that it was borne by its narrators. And that was necessitated because the messenger is no longer among us, upon him be blessing and peace. And so this is just a necessity of the fact. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about here proofs in their essence. So the messenger is a proof that's certain. Because we don't hear him speaking anymore, that's why probability entered into the transmission. But we're not talking about problems of transmission right now or necessities of the time. We're talking about what in essence is a proof. So if ijma in essence is a proof, it means it leads to certain knowledge, not probabilistic knowledge. As for analogy, that's not really a proof to establish a ruling in and of itself. That's only a proof to pass it on, to pass on a ruling which has been established through a text which leads to definite knowledge, to a place which the text hasn't spoken of. So he's saying all proofs have to be definite. The probability of hadith was due to the necessity of transmission. As for qiyas or analogy, it is not a proof to establish a ruling. All it can do is take a ruling established for sure in a source of the four that we've discussed so far and just extend it. So this sentence here is really critical to understand the way he's laying out the book, is that he wants to say that when we talk about things being proofs of sacred law, it's because they're definitely the case. There's no such thing as a probabilistic proof of sacred law. All proofs are definitely the case. Hadiths have an error secondarily so, out of the possibility of error in transmission, but not primarily so. And qiyas is not a proof. It just extends these proofs. And so he says, we're talking right now about the essence of these proofs, proofs in and of themselves. So they have to lead to certain knowledge. There's no such thing as a proof which is not definite in its essence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a proof. And so he says the consensus, the agreement from this group is a proof for a ruling or a statement of sacred law which does not have a clear text about it, out of an honor for this group, ennobling this group. As he himself has said, you are the best of nation brought forth for people, so you could be witnesses. And so this verse has established, these verses have established that trait for this group from him, i.e. from Allah, not from them, as we've mentioned. It's not rationally so, he wanted it so. He wanted to honor them Most High. Furthermore, we didn't make these two, i.e. the hadith which is transmitted not through mass transmission, and the qiyas, the analogy, we didn't make these two a proof with regards knowledge of what is with Allah, of the absolute truth, because these two have probability of error in them. So we don't say they're a proof for what is absolutely true in reality, but rather only with respect to practice. And he'll go into much more detail on this later, that these probabilistic forms of evidence, we follow them because that's the best that we can arrive at, and we are duty bound to do our best, not because they lead to definite knowledge, because there's probability of error in them, as is mentioned, and he'll mention in much more detail elsewhere. And one more additional point here, he says, as far as I can make out the connection, he says, and the fact that you follow something for the duty of practice, not because you know the reality of the case, that's how we function, even for our own rights, because we don't have the knowledge of the realities of things. And that's why in our own disputes and rights, we practice following the testimonies of people, which doesn't lead to definite knowledge. And so in our own lives, the duty of our law and our own practice, we follow things in practice. We don't know if they're true in reality. And that's the case of these hadiths, which are not mass transmitted. And that's the case of these, of the analogy, which is something palpable and real, and we live it day to day in our practices. but ijma' is not from that sort. It's a proof of law. Okay, after that long discussion, a very quick discussion with this fourth verse in rough translation. Whoever opposes the messenger after the guidance has been made clear to them and follows other than the path of the believers, we will turn him to that which he has turned, and we'll burn him in hell, and that's a wicked end. So the point of this verse is there's something called opposing the messenger, and there's something called opposing the path of the believers. And whoever turns away from these is going to hell. So he says, if they could agree, this group of believers could agree on something, and that something be falsehood, then opposing them wouldn't be the equivalent to opposing the messenger. But this verse has shown opposing them is equivalent to opposing the messenger. So when he made opposing them one of the two halves of deserving hell, we knew from it, then it is just like the other half, i.e., these are equivalent then. Opposing the messenger is equivalent then to opposing the path of the believers, because the path of the believers as a collectivity is the path of the messenger. Fifth and final verse, also just one slide. In rough translation, he only quotes this part of the verse, but the first part of it in rough translation. Allah promises those who believe from among you and do righteous deeds, He'll make them inheritors of the earth. He'll give them authority in the earth, just like He did for those who came before them, and He will establish for them their religion, which He is pleased for them, which He has chosen for them. So this phrase, He will establish for them their religion, their deen, which He has chosen for them. That which Allah is pleased with for us is the thing which is true with Him, not the thing which is false with Him. And so if Allah excuses the individual scholar in his mistake and rewards him for his seeking the truth, that reward is for his seeking to be true in. But the deen is that which is sought, not that which is seeking. What he's trying to do again is this parallel, again, this position that Usulis called tasweeb, which is namely that the truth is one. All scholars are exerting themselves to find the one truth with Allah. Not all of them will find it, but there's an ultimate truth. So he says the individual scholar might be rewarded even when he's wrong. He's rewarded for seeking the truth. And what's he seeking? The deen. The deen is that which is sought. The deen is that which all scholars are trying to find. That which is true with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is correct. And so when Allah says He will establish the deen of the community, means He will establish what is correct. And so the community as a whole will be on the deen with Allah. The deen which is murtada with Allah. That is the deen of the community. And that deen is haqq. And the community therefore is on haqq. So those were the angles he took with the 5 Quranic verses. In the hadiths, he just hints at 2 hadiths and says there's others, but this book isn't placed for lots and lots of hadiths. So he simply says 2 hadiths. It's come from the Messenger ﷺ from more than one source, meaning it's not just a one-off narration, from multiple sources that he said, multiple narrators that he said, Allah will not allow my community to gather on misguidance. And also what's come from the Messenger is a threat for opposing the group, because he said, upon him be blessings and peace, whoever opposes the group of believers, even the amount of a handspan, then he has untied the, if you like, the tie of Islam from his neck. It's like he's there's a sort of mark of Islam and he's untied it from his body, if you like, if he opposes this community even by a handspan. So it's a strong threat in there. And he says scholars have authored on this topic lots of hadiths. They've gathered lots of hadiths on this topic. And they've gathered in these books many well-known hadiths that lead to certain knowledge. And what does he mean by well-known hadiths? Again, it's a sort of technical term he'll come to later. All he wants to hint at is there's many well-known hadiths. And when they're combined, it leads to certain knowledge. You could call it a sort of mass transmission in meaning, that lots and lots of well-known hadiths attest to this fact, namely that the community does not agree on error. And so that's the proof from the hadith, because our book is not expansive enough to mention all of these hadiths in an absolute fashion. So I'm just going to, so he says it's enough for me in this book just to mention the verses of the Quran and to indicate that the Sunnah has the like of it. Just a few general questions and then we're done. It's 2 general questions and then we're done. The first general question is, scholars have debated, that's what it appears to be here, what happens when the community agrees and there's a consensus, but they've agreed upon something they arrived at just from their opinion, just from qiyas, a probabilistic source. Or they might have agreed to something which has reached them only from a non-mass transmitted hadith, what they call sometimes a solitary report. So these things in and of themselves don't lead to knowledge. So how can the consensus on these things lead to knowledge, whereas consensus has branched out of these things that don't lead to knowledge? We respond, these sources, which are in and of themselves probabilistic, are now considered connected to the source definitely by means of the ijma, by means of the consensus, because it's been established now by the evidences aforementioned that the group as a whole is protected from falsehood. And so it's become as if these hadiths are now connected to the messenger directly. So the hadith had a doubt of connection. The consensus on the hadith has established that connection to the messenger, and the messenger's approval now of that hadith, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or if it's like an analogy based on something in the book, then this consensus has made it a definite connection to the book now. There's no doubt about it extending what's in the book. And he says, and it's not far-fetched that one person cannot reach the truth with his opinion, but when he's strengthened by the opinion of others, he will reach the truth. Just like he might be too weak to carry something heavy, but he's able to do so when others join him. That's not impossible. New objection. Allah Most High says, O people of the book, why do you object or obstruct the path of God while you are witnesses? So what the objection is saying, that the people of the book have also been called witnesses. Therefore, being a witness can't mean what you're saying, because of what he said right at the beginning of this section, that not all communities have a consensus that leads to truth. He says, yes, but we'll respond now. One way to answer this is that their consensus of these other communities was a proof, so long as they held on to their book. That's one interpretation. But today, their consensus is not a proof, because they have disbelieved in their book. Or they've disbelieved. There's 2 ways to do this. You can say they disbelieved in their book, as he'll be saying soon, because their book indicates that this messenger is true, and they've disbelieved. Or you can say that they disbelieved in the book of the time, which is this book. They are only ascribed to the book because they claim that ascription. Because the interpretation of this verse, the meaning of the verse is, you are witnesses to the messengerhood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So why don't you testify to the truth? That's what the verse is saying. If you look at the context, haven't you considered to strengthen this interpretation? He says this verse, when Allah took the testimony of the people of the book, you must clarify it to people, i.e., the book which has been aforementioned, and the verse started by saying, I didn't copy across all these verses, unfortunately, from Ali Imran. People can go back and check. It says the verse started by saying, "O people of the book, why do you obstruct the path of Allah, from the path of Allah, those who have believed in it, seeking to confuse matters, if you like, or to twist matters, while you are fully aware and fully capable of testifying. So it was clear that what they're talking about, the path of Allah, meaning this book, this messenger, this Quran and this messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the context of all of those passages is that they know that he's the true messenger. Why are they not testifying to it? And that they should convey what their books speak of in this vein. That's what the verses are speaking of. That's his first response to this. And he said, Most High, we sent down the Torah, in it is guidance and light. Again, I didn't copy the whole of this verse, but it says, and they were witnesses to it. So their being witnesses is to what Allah has established for them. Was a proof that leads to definite knowledge, and they became unbelievers by denying that testimony. Okay, there's a small interruption in recording. I hope it wasn't a big problem. So this verse indicates that they are witnesses, alayhi, they are witnesses to this, which is the Torah, whereas this community, our community, is witnesses to people. So it's a different kind of testimony. He didn't just say witnesses over the book. So this indicates definitely that they are witnesses to the rulings of God that affect people. And that if people turn away from what this community have testified to, knowing full well what they've testified to, this will be tantamount to an unbelief. Because the knowledge of truth will not evade this community. So that's the end of this slightly lengthy passage, one of three now, about this point of consensus, because it's an important source of law. It leads to definite knowledge, but it's not rationally arrived at, and that's why it needed a bit of a lengthier exposition. We'll come back inshallah next time for the next discussion of ijma, namely what exactly it is, its definition. Inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.